Hello, everyone. I wanted to do a brief overview video for Unit 3 of the course, which consists of a reading of two longer and really deep and complex texts. The first is Plato's Phaedo, or Phaedo, it doesn't matter how you pronounce it. And the second is Paul Landsberg's The Experience of Death. Just to put it in some historical perspective, Plato, of course, ancient Greek philosopher, lived about 2,500 years ago. Paul Landsberg was a 20th century Catholic philosopher who wrote The Experience of Death in the 1930s. So far in this course, I would say we've been moving within an Epicurean space. And what I mean by that is that despite the differences, important differences between the different thinkers we've read and their varying answers on different questions, no one's really questioned Epicurus's basic theory of death. That theory is in the letter to Menoicus, and basically, I would say, is that the human being in their totality becomes nothing at death. That death is the absolute end of a human existence. That is a theory of death. Death is the privation of all awareness, the permanent, complete, and irrevocable privation of all consciousness, all awareness, all experience, all being. You might call it an annihilationist theory of death. Again, everything that we've read, despite differences of opinion, let's say Nagel had or Bruckner and Fisher had about whether death is bad, and Jonas and Gray's concern with mortality, the presupposition, I would say, of all of the readings so far is that Epicurus is right, that we become nothing at death, that there's nothing after death, that involves us in all sorts of fallacies and mistakes to talk about what happens after death. There is no after death for Epicurus. It is here in Unit 3 of the course that we get a differing idea, which is a much more fundamental difference than any difference that, say, Nagel had with Epicurus, a much more fundamental difference about the nature of death. And I suppose, to put it in plain terms, about what happens to us when we die. These are two readings which share a certain perspective in that they are anti-Epicurean. Both would differ with Epicurus about the finality of death or the notion that we become nothing at death, but there are important differences between them. From Landsberg's perspective, Landsberg's Christian perspective, they couldn't help but be different because Plato lived before Christ. I think that is one of the fundamental messages of Landsberg's The Experience of Death, that there's a before and after in human history, and I think that must be true for every Christian. That is, the appearance of Christ is the event which transforms everything. So from Landsberg's perspective, although Plato was anti-Epicurean, Plato believed in the immortality of the soul, Plato believed in something like an afterlife, it was certainly very different from Landsberg's Christian perspective. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that Landsberg and Plato are both committed to the idea that death is not the absolute end of the human being, but that they have very different ideas about everything, besides that bare fact that they don't believe that death is the end. Plato begins his discussion. I mean, it is, first of all, make sure that you know what you need to read in terms of the Phaedo. I have sent out an announcement about page numbers where the dialogue actually begins in the PDF. But this is a great literary work, Plato's Phaedo. It is a brilliant work of philosophy and literature, really. It's a dialogue taking place on the day that Socrates knows that he will die. And the discussion is about the possibility of the immortality of the soul. And the whole dialogue, despite all of its wonderful dramatic aspects, really highly emotional, beautiful things about it. And at the end of the day, Plato is trying to prove one thing, and that is that the soul is immortal. And he starts with one assumption in that dialogue, you'll find it, and that is that death is the separation of soul and body. That's Plato's starting point. Epicurus' starting point is that death is the privation of all awareness. Plato's starting point, his very first, foundational thing that he says and never really questions, is that death is constituted by the separation of the soul and body. And he's not trying to prove that. What he's trying to prove in the Phaedo is that after that separation, that the soul continues to have an existence independent of the body. And that really becomes, I would say, in the Phaedo and in Landsberg's The Experience of Death, the central question is the possibility of some aspect of us, whether we call it the soul, whether we call it mind, consciousness, whether that's possible without a functioning organism. And it's a great challenge, I would say, of any philosophy which is anti-Epicurean, any philosophy of death which is anti-Epicurean, to try to make it plausible, at least, that there can be such a thing as consciousness, mind, soul, whatever you want to call it, without body. Because clearly, upon the separation of soul and body, the body dies. So really the challenge is to come up with some sort of conception of mind or soul that can exist without body. And that is the great challenge. We're in Unit 3, we open things up again. I mean, it might have seemed from the beginning of the course that this was going to be a sort of atheist, materialist, Epicurean course. And, the first half of it really is. But, there's just as much. I mean, it's up for every one of us to decide whether the things that Landsberg and Plato are arguing for, which is basically life after death, immortality of some sort, it's up to each of us to decide these things for him or herself, whether you really believe something like this or whether you're more comfortable being an Epicurean. That is totally up to you, but it's definitely a respectable opinion in philosophy to believe that death is not the end. And I wanted to give you some great stuff arguing for that. So it is, this is the longest part of the course. That's why Unit 3 lasts the longest in terms of our course, because these are long readings. They're going to take time. Look at the videos. The videos should help. And as always, if you have any specific questions about the readings, content of the readings, if you want clarifications, you can email me, you can call me, and I'd be glad to do what I can.